Hello, I'm Barbara Peters. Welcome to this episode of the Criminal Calendar. We have a man of many names, many faces, and enormous talent with us today, John Maddox Roberts. Hi, John.
Hello.
Should I call you? I made a list because your bibliography goes to 2 pages, I've discovered. Mark Ramsey, this is the name you've written under?
That was my only pseudonym.
Oh, it is the only one?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and as Mark Ramsey, you wrote some books, action stories about a crusader returning to Europe.
Yes, that was in the early 80s. Signet Books was starting out an action-adventure line. These would be books all written under house pseudonyms, house-owned pseudonyms.
Ah, like Nancy Drew, in other words?
Yes, exactly. And they had a couple of Western series, they had a World War II series, they had like a modern action-adventure mercenary type series, and they wanted to do a medieval series. So I had a book floating around at that time that was set during the 100 Years' War. And they wanted the Middle Ages, but they wanted the Crusades. And I said, well, the 100 Years' War is a much more interesting period. And they said, but most Americans don't know which 100 years the 100 Years' War was set in. But everybody heard about the Crusades. Right. So they said, so eventually I agreed. I'd do some books about a crusader coming back. And I had a contract for 6 books, and this was written under a pseudonym, the pseudonym of my choice. I chose Mark Ramsey. The idea was that after 6 books we'd renegotiate. And if we couldn't come to an agreement, in other words, if I asked for more money, then they could farm it out to somebody else. It would still come out under the pen name of Mark Ramsey. So I wrote 4 books in that series. I had a great time. Those were fun books. They were just straight action adventure. And this was a time when you could still write a 50,000-word novel. Now it's very difficult to sell anything that short.
It is indeed. And not only that, you're such a careful researcher, at least into Rome. I have trouble believing that you just wrote action adventure without really doing your homework.
Well, the thing is, I'd already done the homework. I knew the period. I knew, pretty much the minutiae and details of daily life at the time. I knew the history, and I knew the weaponry and armor and stuff that would be in use at that time. So I didn't have to do much research, which is a good thing because they were supposed to be turned in at 2-month intervals. And that was one thing. They wanted to see if I could write that fast. So I wrote the first one in 12 days. And actually, it was 10 days. There were 2 days I wasn't doing much. So I wrote that, turned it in. They said, okay, so write the rest of them. Each book would end with a teaser chapter from the next book.
Well, that's a good idea. It's kind of like the old Perils of Pauline. Tune in next Saturday or however.
Right. And I wrote the first 4 books. I did those in a period of about 3 or 4 months. And the 4th book ended with a teaser chapter from the 5th book. And so I sat and waited for Word to finish it. They had the outline of the 5th book. And after a while, I just called up to my editor, Robin Grunder, who was there at Signet at that time, and a stranger answered the phone. And it turned out that Signet had been sold to somebody else, and they hadn't bothered to tell the writers.
That's a little early in the kind of thing we're seeing more commonly now. But
I got very used to it in later years. And the new owners just terminated the whole action-adventure line. It just stopped right there. And so I never got to do books 5 and 6. But that one chapter from the 5th book is still floating out there. And people to this day ask me where they can find a copy of that 5th book in the series, because they know it's there because they'd read the first chapter of it.
Is there any real impediment, if you had time in your schedule, to your doing those 2 books, or does Signet still own the name and whatever?
No, I've got all the rights back. But the main problem now with it is the length of the books. It's hard to sell a 50,000-word novel now. I maybe could possibly do an omnibus edition.
Or you could crash 5 and 6 together if you could figure out a way to do that.
That would be possible if I could remember what it was that 5th book was about. It has been quite a few years.
I asked because, in a way, this was the Crusader thing is kind of ahead of its time, because Bernard Cornwell has usurped your 100-Year War, because he's really stomped all over and made that. He has a new book out called Agincourt or Azincourt. He's done, I think, 3, a trilogy. Also set in that era, but there seems to be, we're calling them Hearts of Oak at the moment, not action adventure, but the kinds of stuff that Patrick O'Brien wrote on the sea, or C.S. Forrester wrote, or Cornwell's writing land-based, and ranging over, I think, a pretty large historical period.
Yeah. Well, when a couple of years ago, when Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven was about to come out, or at least I knew that it was coming out in the next year, I called my agent and I said, look, if this movie, what his movie Gladiator did for the Roman period and arousing interest in the period, why don't we try and resell the Falcon books? That was the Crusader series,
right?
And see if we can get a publisher to go along with that. And she tried, but they didn't seem to think so. And then the movie itself didn't do as well, certainly as Gladiator did. I guess it did well enough, but and a bunch of Crusade period books came out at that time to cash in on such popularity as the movie enjoyed, but couldn't pick up a publisher for those old
It's interesting because I know that Robin, you know, where a lot of interest really arose was in Malta, the whole siege there, the Knights Templar. I think that's all a blowback from Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code. Everybody got terribly interested in the Templars and the various brotherhoods and all the potential secret documents and secret sects and all the rest of it.
Yeah, that period is very ill understood, and of course with the secret society aspect of it, of the Templars, and then the connection with the Masons and so forth. There's a big market for that now, and you know, I don't know how well it really ties in with what really happened in the real Crusades and the real Templars. As a matter of fact, I have a friend who is both a Mason and a historian, and he's written a book or two just on what all these other books got wrong about both Freemasonry and the real history of the Templars and so forth. But there's just something enormously attractive, it seems, to that there's a secret history behind the history that we know.
Well, I think people have always been interested in that idea of secret societies really running the world, and that maybe that's why it's so confused. And everybody likes a treasure hunt, which is a huge part of it. Yeah,
the whole thing of the Da Vinci Code, and I've seen several television documentaries on it, the various sites in the book, and now that people make whole pilgrimages just to go to that one church that has the brass line in the floor, and the chapel in Scotland. And
there's the Scotland one, and then there's also the estate in France, the name of which has gone right out of my head, something Laurence or something. But there were two major sites. I myself was fonder of Angels and Demons, the book he wrote that was set in Rome, and I think it has a big finish at the Castle St. Angelo. And and I thought that was the first time he introduced that concept and that character, and I thought it came off better than the Da Vinci Code. But I find that people who read Angels and Demons like it better, if they read it first, like it better than the Da Vinci Code, and vice versa. But aside from that, you have also written an enormous number, well, another action-adventure. You did some writing in the Conan series, right?
Yeah, I did. I happened to be at a convention some years ago and met I knew them before, but I got into a conversation with L. Sprague and Catherine DeCamp, both very prominent in the science fiction field, and they'd just written a biography of Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan, who lived his entire life in Cross Plains, Texas.
Not Conan, you mean the creator?
No, Robert E. Howard. And I spoke with them, and they seemed to be impressed that I knew something about Howard himself, not just about the stories, which had been, for the most part, out of print for decades.
When did he publish those originally?
These were in the middle 30s.
And wasn't it Conan the Barbarian? Don't I remember that was his whole name?
Well, that was the character. He was just, actually in the books he was just called Conan. And they weren't books, they were short stories. They were published mainly in Weird Tales magazine. And there were, I think, about 19 stories that featured the character Conan the Barbarian.